In this video, we'll introduce you about the transgender people in China. And firstly, I will tell you something about who are transgender people. Transgender is an umbrella term for those people who have a gender identity or gender expression that differs from the sex assigned to them at birth. Their anatomies and/or appearances do not conform to their predominant gender roles. They have physical and/or behavioral characteristics which have already identified them as having a non-conforming gender identity. The term of transgender may also include people who are transsexual, cross-dressers, performers, intersex, and gender benders and/or androgynes. Transsexual people are those who receive medical assistance like sex reassignment therapies like hormone replacement therapy, sex reassignment surgery, or psychotherapy to permanently transit to the sex or gender with which they identify. They may transit from male to female and female to male. Also, they have the risk of experiencing gender dysphoria as they express a desire to live as and be accepted as a member of their identified gender. However, being transgender is different from their sexual orientation. Transgender people may identify as heterosexual, in other words, straight, homosexual, in other words, gay or lesbian, bisexual, asexual, or otherwise, may decline to label their sexual orientation. In China, there are several terms to describe transgender people. 变性 is the most common way to say change one's sex, although it is not necessarily through medical therapies like sexual reassignment surgery. 变性 may also include hormonal changes and lifestyle changes. Besides, the term 跨性别, literally cutting across sex distinctions, has recently come into use as an official literal translation of English term transgender, but 跨性别 is not in popular use outside of academics. Moreover, 人妖 in Mandarin, which can be translated into human ghost, human monster, or freak, is commonly used to target transgender people and have in some ways a feeling of discrimination, but it has historically been used for any kind of gender transgression.
Now, let me introduce two concepts, gender performativity and intersectionality, that are important to understand transness and the transgender community in a more comprehensive way. First, let's look at gender performativity. Gender performativity is coined by queer theorist Judith Butler in 1990. In her book Gender Trouble, Butler explains this notion that gender is the repeated stylization of the body, a set of repeated acts within a highly rigid regulatory frame that congeal over time to produce the appearance of substance, of a natural sort of being. A bit hard to understand? Don't worry, let me explain this to you. To explain it, gender performativity primarily describes that gender is not something inherent in people, but constructed through repeated gendered acts. For example, as Beauvoir said, one is not born a woman, but becomes one. The gender of a woman is not natural or inherent like an organ. Instead, it is constructed and reinforced through her learning and performing how a woman should talk, behave, dress, etc. in everyday life. And the same for men. Another point made by Butler is that gender is not consistent with sex, nor should gender be taken as a male-female binary system. In other words, there is not a natural consistency between one's assigned sex at birth and one's social gender. Such a seeming consistency is indeed a social construct, just like gender binary. Now, since you have a basic understanding of what gender performativity is, you may have some idea about how transness reflects the concept of gender performativity. As you've learned about who are transgender people in the last section, you may grasp the idea that transgender people debunk the consistency between biological sex and socially constructed gender. They also problematize and bravely challenge the dominant gender ideology that gender is original and inherent in people. Now, let's move to the second concept, intersectionality. Intersectionality is a term coined by scholar Kimberly Bucranshaw in 1989 to describe how gender, race, class, and other identities intersect with one another and overlap, resulting in interdependent systems of disadvantage. So why is this concept of intersectionality important to understand transness and transgender community? Well, first, this concept helps us to understand the multiple forms of discrimination, oppressions, and violence facing transgender people. For example, a trans woman who is attracted to women is faced with at least 3 forms of oppressions compounding together, which are transphobia, sexism, and homophobia. These trans people who undergo multiple forms of discrimination and oppressions are particularly vulnerable. Besides the example brought up just now, such particularly vulnerable groups also include, but are not limited to, trans people in sex work, trans migrants, elderly trans people with disabilities, religious trans people whose faiths oppose transness. In summary, the concept of intersectionality makes us recognize important differences in terms of trans people's lived experiences that are often impacted by multifold discrimination and oppressions.
After getting a basic understanding of who transgender people are and the definition of performativity and intersectionality, we can deduce that transgender people are suffering from being discriminated and not recognized. So why and how trans people are discriminated? According to a 7-country factor analytic studies, the mental illness view of gender identity variance may prompt or provide a supporting rationale for trans prejudice. It implies that the ideal trans people are pathological and are inherently mentally ill is still prevalent. Furthermore, if we think deeper about reasons why people discriminate, stigmatize, and do not recognize them as normal people, it is a severe problem, further beyond a singular point of oppression. Based on Scott's arguments, racism does not only occur in moments when people of color are excluded from employment opportunities. Instead, it also occurs when media perpetuates stereotypes about people of color. Transphobia can be also applied in this discourse. He brings up a word subjection and argues that it captures how the systems of meaning and control that concern us permeate our lives, our ways of knowing about the world, and our ways of imagining transformation. In this way, it is indispensable to build and complete relative laws, which lay foundation for gradually eliminating the invisible oppression and discrimination permeated into every aspect of our lives. Then, how are they discriminated? Firstly, they are excluded from many working opportunities, pushing them to work at society's margins, such as sex workers, which exposes them to severe health issues. Secondly, according to laws in some countries, trans people have no rights changing documents that specify legal gender status and are unable to marry within a mixed gender partnership. Thus, they are denied associated family rights, including adoption of children. Thirdly, due to public decency laws, public abuse towards trans people is common and violent. Lastly, particularly across Asia, laws against homosexuality put heterosexual trans people at the risk of prosecution. They face more kinds of discrimination. Listed below are hard to cover what they have experienced. And then in China, to take the equal rights of labor of transgender minorities as an example, though equal right has been protected by the Chinese constitution and laws, no anti-discrimination law has been made to enforce them, which has a positive impact on effective implementation of international law on equal rights transgender minorities in China. Wei Zhou published an academic proposal on a draft of anti-discrimination law of PRC. The proposal puts forward proper measures for employers to guarantee equal rights of labor of employees. Although it is still a long way towards completing its legislation on anti-discrimination, some progress can be seen, and China can draw useful guides from international or national documents. And some countries are ahead of time in terms of protecting transgender rights. For example, India's court guaranteed the country's transgender people and those classified as third gender the right to self-identity without sex reassignment surgery in 2014. Also, in 2015, Maratha's government adopted the Gender Identity, Gender Expression, and Sex Characteristics Act. It acknowledges that gender identity is considered to be an inherent part of a person, which may or may not need surgical or hormonal treatment or therapy.
Last but not least, what can non-transgender people do, and how can non-transgender people help advancing transgender rights? In China, depression is prevalent among a significant number of transgender people. 43.4% of transgender people in China have depression. There are 56.4% Chinese transgender people had suicidal ideation, and 16.1% had suicide attempts. The mental health of transgender people shouldn't be neglected in China. According to Xie, family rejection and abandonment and discrimination are significant factors that contributed to their mental problems. Family rejection is considered as the special reason. Therefore, one thing that non-transgender people can do is to understand transgender people is to accept their identity, especially their family members. Although it might be difficult for those who are from less developed regions in China, because of traditional values, it is very important that we should take transgender people's mental well-beings into account and empower them to feel comfortable and to participate in society. The first step to understand transgender people is to affirm their identity, which can simply be done by using their preferred names and pronouns. Other than that, research conducted by Alin Zhang has shown that creating informal social support rather than judicial justice might be more helpful to transgender people who once experienced intimate partner violence in China. Her research shown that sisterhood and informal social support from internet friends and NGOs that are hidden and safe from judging, criminalizing, and stigmatizing gaze of the public. Although sisterhood or informal social support usually comes within the transgender community in China, this community is usually vulnerable due to everyday violence they need to face. Therefore, it is also important for non-transgender people to join the non-judging and non-stigmatizing ally to be part of the informal social support that gives the sense of comfort to transgender people in China in fighting against everyday violence. This is the end of our video. Thanks for watching.